Good afternoon. Welcome to our Carnegie Council book talk with David Nasaw, author of the new book, The Last Million, Europe's Displaced Persons from World War to Cold War. I'm Joel Rosenthal, president of the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. Those of us in the Carnegie family of institutions have a special affection for David. His biography of Andrew Carnegie, published in 2006, was a life-changing event for us. Through David's work, we've come to know Andrew Carnegie in all of his humanity and complexity. And there's one lesson from the book that really stayed with me and has animated my work at the Carnegie Council. And that is, as David would put it, Carnegie's cockeyed optimism was not entirely misplaced. For all the madness we see in the world, progress based on reason and a can-do spirit is indeed possible. That idea keeps me going, and this occasion gives me the opportunity to say thank you, David. In addition to the Carnegie biography, David's previous books include prize-winning biographies of Joseph P. Kennedy and William Randolph Hearst. Today we turn to David's latest book, a portrait of not one person, but of the over 1 million displaced persons who emerged brutalized yet alive on VE Day, April 1945. The Last Million is an epic story. It takes us right into the heart of Europe during and after World War II. It describes the movements of millions of people among shifting borders and general chaos, the chaos of that war and its aftermath. It describes life at the street level and politics in the highest reaches of government. Millions of people were displaced by World War II. Most known were those sent to concentration camps, yet there were also migrant laborers, forced laborers, collaborators, political prisoners, and POWs. When the war ended, many, if not most, displaced persons returned home. Yet, as the title suggests, 1 million did not. This book tells the story of their search for a new home. So David, thanks for joining us. And to kick it off, I just have a simple question, which is, how did you come to this story? How did you see The Last Million as a singular story to be told?
I think it had a lot to do with Tony Judd's extraordinary book, Post-War. And I had learned not to take the common sense view of historical events as necessarily truthful, sometimes only partially truthful. When I read Tony Judd's book, it became clear to me, much clearer than it had been before, that wars don't end with peace treaties, with the cessation of hostilities, even with the soldiers going home. War bleeds into post-war, and the suffering for civilians who have been displaced by war continues unabated. In the case of The Last Million, for 3 to 5 years that they remained in Germany, in camps, many behind barbed wire. For 3 to 5 years, let me emphasize, after VE Day.
So you start with the, let's talk about the million who remain. And you talk about the 1 million into Germany. Can you give us a little bit of information about who these people were and who went willingly and who didn't?
Yeah, there were 3 different streams into Germany during the war. The largest was the stream of forced slave laborers from Eastern Europe, mostly from Poland and the Ukraine. These were, in large part, adolescents and young men and women who were grabbed from their homes, forced onto trucks and trains into Germany. Hitler and the Third Reich leadership knew from the very beginning that the only possible way to send millions of soldiers to the Eastern Front was to replace them with millions more forced enslaved laborers from the East. So that was the first group, and they began arriving in 1940, 1941, and continued to arrive through the end of the war. The second stream that made up the last million came in 1944 and 1945 from Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and parts of Ukraine. And these were men, women, and their children, the men and women who had in one way or another collaborated with the Nazi authorities. Sometimes that collaboration meant simply working in a post office that was overseen by a Nazi official. In other cases, it meant serving in the auxiliary police and rounding up Jews. In some cases, it meant joining a Waffen-SS division. When it became clear that the Red Army was on its march and would soon arrive in the Baltic states and in the Ukraine, thousands upon thousands of citizens who had collaborated in some way, and citizens who could not abide the thought of living under Soviet domination, made their way into Germany. The third group were the Jewish survivors. As the war came to an end, Hitler and the German officials realized that they didn't want the fact of the death camps to be discovered by the Russians in the world, number one. Number two, they needed more labor at home than they were getting from the forced laborers and slave laborers. And the decision was made to relocate those who had survived the death camps and the labor camps in Poland and in the Balkans, to relocate them, to death march them into Germany, where they would be not gassed, but worked to death, most of them in underground mines, mills, armament factories. These are the three groups that make up the last million. Their journeys into Germany are different. So too would be their experiences in Germany.
So it's VE Day or a little bit after. We're in Europe, 1945. Can you give us a little bit of a feel for what it's like in these camps, and what sort of the life, and then what sort of futures or choices are these people looking at?
Germany, there is no way to comprehend the devastation in Germany that the displaced persons found when they left their workplaces or their concentration camps or their POW camps. They were rounded up by the Allies, put on trucks, gotten out of the way, shipped to assembly centers, and then sorted out by nationality and put into camps behind barbed wire often. Camps that were run by UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, but supplied by the armies. The armies supplied them with food, medical supplies, shelter. They built facilities, and then UNRWA took care of them. What happened was that in Germany, in the years following VE Day, in these camps, there were little Ukraines, little Latvias, little Jewish settlements. In the beginning, the UNRWA and the Allies decided that they were going to separate out the last million by nationality. They did not recognize that there was such a thing as a Jew. Lithuanian Jews were sequestered with Lithuanians, Polish Jews with non-Jewish Poles. In many instances, the Jewish survivors found themselves in the same camps as those who had been their guards in the concentration or labor camps. That ended in July and August, and the Jews were put into their own camps. The sense in all of these camps was that this was transitional, that they would soon be allowed to go home. The Latvians, the Estonians believed that World War III was coming rapidly. And the Americans and the British were going to liberate the Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania from the Soviets. And the displaced persons could go home again. The same with the Poles. The Jews knew that they could never go home again, that they had no place in Europe, though some of the Bundists tried in the beginning to convince themselves and others that they could return to Poland and build a new Jewish community. For the Jews, the only place on earth they soon recognized where they would be welcome was Palestine. Though the British did everything they possibly could under the mandate to keep the Jews out.
I want to pause here for a second to talk about, there were those who couldn't go home, understood that, but at one point a decision is made to not force repatriation, that individuals would have a choice whether they would be forced home or not. Could you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, one of the things I realized as I did my research was that the Cold War begins almost immediately. That there's the ramp from World War to Cold War is a steep one. And in the very beginning, the Soviets and their allies in Eastern Europe and the Soviet-dominated lands of Eastern Europe, they demand that every displaced person, except for the Jews and those who had been displaced by Franco years before, every displaced person should go home. Whether they wanted to or not, they had to go home. The Allies said no. The Americans and the British said no. People have the right to choose their own citizenship and whether they wanted to go home or not. The Soviets were convinced, and there is a paranoia that has some basis in the reality. After the Great War, after World War I, the Allies tried to overthrow the Bolshevik regime. And Stalin and some of his compatriots believed that that was a real possibility after World War II. And what the Allies were doing, what the British and the Americans were doing, was creating an army of anti-Soviet, anti-communist dissidents that would be available to spread anti-Soviet propaganda and or begin World War III.
So I want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned in passing the establishment of these international institutions to deal with this problem. So first we have UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Authority, and then later we have the IRO, the International Refugee Organization. And there is a amazing passage in your book. For those who will look at it, it's on page 258. I'm not going to read it. It's the beginning of chapter 17, where you talk a little bit about how these organizations in their name, they sort of hint at a mission of being sort of humane institutions meant, to provide literally relief for this immediate human suffering, and yet they turn into something else, right? They turn into these sort of utilitarian employment agencies, if you will. Can you talk a little bit about those institutions and how they're set up and where they eventually go?
Yeah, Franklin Roosevelt is in this book and in others something of a hero. He understands in 1943 that there will be an enormous refugee problem, not only in Europe, but in Asia as well when the war is over. And the only way to solve a refugee problem is through international cooperation. And he is instrumental, again, this is in 1943, in setting up, before the United Nations, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. And he gets the nations of the world, including the Soviet Union, to join. The understanding is that it will be an agency that repatriates, that takes care of the immediate needs of the refugees, and then provides passage home for them. For the last million, that doesn't happen. And although the Soviets demand that they be sent home or, made to survive on their own in Germany, the Americans and the British continue to support these people in camps for a year and a half, until it becomes clear that they're not going home. The Americans and the British spearhead the establishment of a new organization without the Soviets. The Soviets won't join it. And its task is not to repatriate, but to resettle the last million. And beginning in late 1946, 1947, there is this extraordinary, bizarre meat market set up as one of the UNRWA employees calls it, a meat market set up in the displaced persons camps. And all the members of the International Refugee Organization, the IRO, dozens of Latin American nations, Canada, Australia, South Africa, they send delegations, recruiters into the camps to find workers to take jobs that they can't find anybody else to take. It begins with the British. The British have a severe labor shortage, and they can't get anybody to work in the tuberculosis sanitarium or in the hospitals. So what do? They go into the camps and they recruit thousands of Latvian women in the beginning. And then they decide, this has worked so well, we need help in the mines, we're going to bring in Latvian men. And when the Latvians run out, they go to Lithuanians and Estonians and Ukrainians and Poles. The Belgians need miners, the French need miners. The Canadians need railroad workers and people to work in forestry. And so the International Refugee Organization becomes a labor recruitment organization. It tries to look after the welfare of those that are sent abroad, but the shots are being called by the governments that are doing the recruiting, not the international organization.
So there is sort of a hierarchy in terms of desirability in the resettlement process. And is some of that based on race and on perception, or maybe it's just more of just pure utilitarian function or some combination?
It's a combination. It's a combination. The Latvians are always the first choice.
Yeah.
The Australian Prime Minister makes it clear to the recruiting team going out, get the Latvians. Why? Because the Latvians are white, the Latvians are Protestant, the Latvians are reliably anti-communist, and the Latvians had only arrived, unlike the Poles or the Jews, they had only arrived in Germany at the end of the war, and they were relatively healthy. They hadn't suffered the ravages of the war that the Jewish survivors of the Polish forced laborers had suffered. And it was felt that they were hard workers and they were assimilable. No country on earth wanted the Jews. And they didn't want the Jews, again, for a variety of reasons. They weren't reasons, a variety of myths, of misconceptions. They regarded the Jews as clannish, as unwilling to do hard manual labor, as scoundrels, as rogues, as thieves, and worse yet, as Bolshevik sympathizers or operatives. So from 1947 to 1948, as the Latvians and the Ukrainians and the Estonians were resettled outside of the camps, the Jews were left. The only way for the Jews to get out of those camps was through illegal immigration to Palestine. The British tried to stop the ships that left from Marseille and from Italian ports and Bulgarian ports bound for Israel, but they couldn't do it. And 20, 30,000 displaced Jews made their way to Israel. Once they arrived in Haifa, the British grabbed them, put them on a second series of ships and sent them to Cyprus and put them behind barbed wire in displaced persons camps. But for the Jews, getting out of Germany, even to go into another set of displaced persons camps, was far preferable than remaining in the land of their murderers.
David, so many questions about the story of the Jewish displaced persons. I want to ask you a little bit about Truman as it relates to this story. So the way I'm reading it in the narrative is, he's willing to confront the British to say, you need to open up Palestine. I mean, it's a painful process, but he eventually confronts the British and sort of gets there or in that direction. He's not willing to confront the US Congress in terms of opening up the United States. Is that fair, or is that being
Yes, no, that's absolutely fair. Truman believes in the very beginning, with this naive optimism. The State Department says, don't go there. But Truman says, I'm going there. And he confronts, at Potsdam, he confronts Churchill and then Attlee immediately and says, you got to open up Palestine to the Jewish displaced persons. And he hints that if you want the loans that you need to rebuild your nation, you got to help me out here. I've got lots of Jewish voters and I need their support. And it's the humanitarian thing to do. And it's the right thing to do. And then he lets, go this further argument, which is just tragic. He says to the British, he says, you don't have to worry the way you did before the war. He said, 6 million Jews were killed. They're dead. So the European Jews aren't going to overwhelm Palestine. We're not talking about millions here. We're talking about a couple 100,000. The British will not budge. And the British say to Truman, look, if you care this much about the European Jews, take them into the United States. That Truman knows. He's much smarter about domestic politics than British politics or international politics. Truman knows he can't do that. That's not possible. That the hostility to the European Jews, the misunderstanding of what has happened to them, is such that Congress is never going to allow them into the country.
Just on Truman too, there was a question I had. There was sort of a scene in the book, or a few scenes strung together, and this goes back to the camps themselves. And word gets back to Truman that the situation is really dire, and these camps are really, people are suffering. And he talks to Eisenhower and basically tells him to clean it up. And Eisenhower goes back and goes through a tour of the camp, and particularly the Jewish camps, right? And makes it a point that these are under United States authority, United States command, and we're going to clean it up. Did I read that right? And I mean, was that an act of humanity, or was I kind of romanticizing Truman and Eisenhower a little bit in light of more recent events when we see the treatment of displaced people under United States authority?
Truman and Eisenhower come out as the heroes in this book. I mean, flawed heroes, but heroes nonetheless. Truman recognizes from the very beginning the plight of the displaced persons and the Jewish displaced persons. And there are those who said Clark Clifford, his advisor, says it's because he had read the Bible from early on and he knows the Jews belong in Israel. I don't know whether that's the case. But he feels the pain. In the beginning, we got to realize what a mess Europe was right after the war. Nobody knew how many Jews had survived. We knew that millions had been killed, but no one knew what the condition was or how many made it out of the camps. And there was this sense, the State Department had this sense, and the British had this sense. The Jews have suffered, but so has everybody else in this war. And we can't single out the Jews. The Jewish organizations in the United States and in Britain said the Jews have suffered more than any other group, and they need special treatment. The American State Department and the United Nations in the beginning said no. The British said absolutely not. The Jews will be treated like everyone else. Well, the Jews were treated like everyone else. And the suffering was intense. And finally, in July, 2 months after the war was over, in July, Truman sends a fact-finding mission led by Dean Harrison, Dean Earl Harrison of the University of Pennsylvania. And he sends Harrison, who was not a Zionist, was not a Jew, sends him to visit the camps. And Harrison comes back with a report. And he says, we are treating the Jews just as badly as the Germans did, except we're not exterminating them. And Truman reads this report and writes a letter immediately to Eisenhower and says to Eisenhower, you got to take care of this. This is inhumane, this is impossible, this is un-American. And Eisenhower, goes to work.
That's great. I wanted to, you mentioned before I want to move to the Cold War aspect of this. And could you say a little bit more about the sort of the Soviets' interests in this whole situation? How does it look from Moscow as they're looking at this problem, and how does this drift into the beginning stages of the Cold War from the East?
The Soviets know that large numbers of collaborators and war criminals have escaped from the East, have escaped from the Baltic nations, from Belarus, from Ukraine, and made their way into Germany. And, in the book, I tell many stories of war criminals and collaborators who throw away their uniforms and all the papers that they have, invent new histories for themselves, find their way into the displaced persons camps. Once in the displaced persons camps, they invent past histories. They had been farmers, they had been factory workers. The Soviets know, and the Poles know, and the Yugoslavs know that there are these war criminals there, and they want them to bring them to justice. That's number one. Number two, they know that there is a cauldron of anti-communism in these camps, and it's going to affect the future direction of Europe and the world. That having these dedicated, recalcitrant anti-communists and anti-Soviets let loose in the world is not going to, it's going to cause them hardship. And then the third, and maybe the most important reason, is the Soviets and the Poles and the Yugoslavs have an extraordinary task of rebuilding their nations. And they need every laborer they can, including the members of the last million who are idle in Germany rather than returning to Poland to rebuild a devastated country.
Great. So I want to turn now to the United States. So it takes a while, and I don't remember exactly when it happens, but there is a bill passed in the United States Congress signed by President Truman for resettlement of refugees here in the United States. It's a couple of years later, it takes time. But this is the big question, and I'm sure everybody will feel this when they're reading the book. Why doesn't the United States, you could talk about the other countries as well, but I'll focus on the United States, do more to sort of sort out the war criminals, the collaborators, the Nazis, and others, as they begin to issue visas for resettlement in the United States?
For a long time, it was felt that the Americans and the British and the Canadians and the Australians didn't keep the war criminals and the collaborators out because they didn't know how to do it. In doing my research, I discovered that wasn't the case. In every displaced persons camp, there was a historical commission. In Poland, the surviving Jews immediately established a historical commission. In Austria, the most famous of the Jewish or the Nazi hunters, Simon Wiesenthal, sets up a commission. They take testimony from the displaced persons. They have lists, long lists. They know who in the camps of the displaced persons, who among the displaced persons are war criminals or collaborators who should be tried. No one consults them. No one gives a damn. And one of the reasons for this is that the memories of World War are obliterated by the fears of Cold War. Hitler has been defeated, so the sentiment is in the United States. The fascists, the Nazis have been defeated. They're not coming back. The danger moving forward is from the Cold War. And this notion that there is such a thing called totalitarianism and that Stalin is a latter-day Hitler. The Soviets are the same as the Germans. And we've got to turn from fighting one war to fighting the other almost immediately. And so what if some of these displaced persons were Nazi collaborators or were anti-Soviet and fought against the Red Army? So what if they joined the Waffen-SS? You know, they're anti-communists and we need them now. Let's forget the past and let's move forward. And this happens. This happens everywhere. There's a story I tell which just stays with me of a group of miners in England who discover, the miners are left wing, but it doesn't really matter. They discover that the Latvians, displaced persons who were working with them in the mines, have Waffen-SS tattoos. And they threaten to go on strike unless something is done about it. And when this gets back to the government, a labor government, the labor government says, well, you know, what we'll do is we'll keep all the former Waffen-SS soldiers, we'll keep them out of the mines and we'll put them in jobs where they don't have to take off their shirts and no one will see their tattoos. In 1951, the Americans changed their regulations, their immigration regulations, to let in former members of the Waffen-SS. It's not a pretty picture. And it's because this country or Congress, I don't know about the people on the street, but Congress is beset by this Cold War hysteria.
So David, as I was reading, so I understand that in the context of the time, the 1940s and into the early 50s, there does seem to be a little bit right towards the end of the book. There's kind of this wave, maybe in the 1980s, and maybe it's just time goes by. It's like 30 years later. There, and maybe Simon Wiesenthal becomes more well known. I don't know, but there is this sort of wave of these sort of famous cases, Ivan the Terrible and all these things that kind of pop up. It's sort of, I think of it during the Reagan years. I mean, is that just a function of time in a way, some time, or is it I'm just curious how you read that, where it kind of bubbles up.
Yeah, it bubbles up in the United States.
Yeah.
In the United States. Yeah. And it's funny because Simon Wiesenthal is 50% of the time he's wrong. He accuses people who he shouldn't accuse, but 50% of the time he's right. And there is this residue of Nazi hunters
Yeah.
who nobody listens to for 30 years. And beginning in the 70s, reporters and journalists who, some of them Jewish, some of them not Jewish, look again at what went on 30 years before. And there begin to be leaks from INS. The INS leaks to reporters and to Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman, the news, that there is in the records of the Immigration and Naturalization Service lists of Nazi collaborators who were led into the country as displaced persons. And because of the crusade of the journalists and of Liz Holtzman and a couple of other congressmen, the question is reopened in the United States. And once the United States begins to look again at what happened 30 years before, how did these people get into the United States? How many are still here? And what can we do about it? The Canadians and the Australians and the Brits begin to start the same process. Regrettably, it's too late. It's too late. Even those who were brought to justice have had, a good 30 years in the United States. Their crimes unpunished.
So I just want to alert the audience. I have a couple more questions for David, but I do want to encourage those who are watching, if you have a question or a comment, to submit them via the chat function, and we'll try to get to those towards the end of the hour. So David, I can't resist asking this question. I'm sure a lot of people are thinking it, and I do want to avoid sort of simple or facile comparisons, but we're living in a world now where I looked this up, there were just last year 80 million forced displaced people in the world. So this is a live issue in a different way. But I just have to ask you, having spent all this time on this story and telling this story, what does it leave you with now as you look at the world today? Lessons learned or thoughts that you could connect to the situation we find ourselves in today?
One of the tragedies in the present day situation, let me start with the most obvious, to me at least. In 1943, Roosevelt establishes an international organization because he understands that this is an international problem that requires international cooperation. Until the present administration, the United States believed in international cooperation to do something about the refugees. Now, having said that, the obligation of the United Nations and its participating nations has been not to repatriate or resettle the refugees, but to shelter and feed and supply them with minimal medical assistance in the camps. In the 70 years since the end of the displaced persons camps in Germany, the sense has been that the limits of the world's responsibility is to make sure none of these people starve, not to allow them to lead meaningful lives through repatriation or through resettlement. And this is a tragedy it's only going to get worse. In my book, at the end, the only place for the displaced Jews to resettle is an independent Israel. And I make the argument that Truman supports the establishment and the independence of Israel because he knows that in order to establish an independent West Germany, which the West needs as the bulwark of an anti-communist coalition, he's got to get the Jews out of Germany. There can't be a West Germany with 250,000 Jews in camps. And the only place he can get them out, he can't get them into the United States, is Israel. So he supports an independent Israel. But where do those Jews go? Where did the European Jews go? They are settled in rural communities, on agricultural settlements, in houses and in apartments that have been cleared of Palestinians by the Israeli army. Or in the case of those who had left voluntarily, the Israelis refused to let the Palestinians return. So the problem of the displaced Jews is solved by the displacement of Palestinians. And while I do not want to diminish the suffering of the Jews who end up in Israel, their displacement lasted 5 years. The displacement of the Palestinians is now into its 3rd generation, with no signs of their ever being repatriated or resettled.
Thank you. So my last question, and I'm going to then move it over to Alex Woodson, who's going to sort of tee it up, and maybe he can tee it up with this first question. But I did want to make note of this theme of aftermaths, the way that you conclude the book, the sort of coda to the book is titled Aftermaths. And to me, that sort of suggests some idea of regeneration or some growth. I don't know. I mean, it's sort of, I guess it's the tragedy then leads to some redemption in some way. I don't know, or maybe it just spins off another one. But I don't know. I just want, before I let you go and go over to the questions, I mean, do you have a sense of redemption here, or do you just feel like the cycle kind of, the way you just left it there, it just kind of repeats itself? But
I met in, let me tell 2 stories quickly.
Yeah.
One, Peter Beiner
Yeah.
told me, and there's a new book about the Holocaust and the Nakba, and it tells about 2 displaced persons who, when they arrive in Israel, are sent to an apartment in Haifa, and as they move in, they see that the apartment is fully furnished, and they realize that it's there because the Palestinians have left, and they look at it and they think about their suffering, and they turn around and they leave. They won't live there. The second story is about a man named Itzik Lachman and his wife Lola, who I talk about. I met Itzik, he was 98. His wife Lola was much younger. She was 96. And they had known each other in Poland. They had met in Dachau and then got married in Feldafing. And the 2 of them had lost their entire families, had suffered immensely in camp after camp after camp. And through the kindness of cousins, their only remaining relatives in the United States, they were resettled, relocated. He was a locksmith. They found work for him. They found a home for the family. Itzik and Lola raised 3 kids. They have a large brood of grandchildren who come to visit them in their assisted living facility. And at the end of this discussion, I look at Itzik and I say, I try to ask a final question, and he looks at me knowing what I'm going to ask. He says, "It's a good life." He said, "I've had a good life." He said, "I love my wife. We've been married for 70 years. I love my children." He said, "And I will forever thank my cousins in America for finally letting me in."
Yeah. Thank you. I want to make sure we have some time for some questions. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Alex Woodson, and he's going to ask on behalf of those who have been writing in. I see the chat lines really lighting up. So Alex, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Joel. Thanks,
Yeah.
David. The first question is from Deborah Rogers. Can you speak about the survival spirit and how people kept hope alive?
It's an extraordinary, it's an extraordinary story, and I don't want to downplay it, especially in the Jewish camps. The surviving remnant, as they called themselves, recognized that mourning was a luxury. They would not forget the 6 million, but their task was to resurrect Judaism, not in Europe. They were all clear about that. With the Poles believed that in exile, the anti-communist Poles, that it was their job, that it was their task, that it was their mission to resurrect a cultural nationalism, to keep it alive. So the spirit in these displaced persons camps was not one of defeat or victimization, but one of preparation for the next stage in their lives, which they hoped and knew would follow.
Thanks. This is from David Kent, kind of a personal question. My father was a Jewish refugee from Austria who escaped to England in 1938, was interned in Australia from 1940 to 1942, and then returned to England. He came to the United States in May of 1948, but came as a displaced person because the quota for Austria was too small and already filled. How could he have come as a displaced person when the US didn't pass the act until June? He definitely came as a displaced person.
Yeah, there was a, I haven't talked about it in this interview. There was a Truman directive, and Truman, in large part because he couldn't get the British to move, said that the German and the Austrian quotas would be enlarged, would be combined, number one. And number two, he set up offices in and around the displaced persons camps to provide visas under the quotas for those who could establish German or Austrian citizenship in some way. So a small number of German and Austrian Jews were allowed to enter before the Displaced Persons Act. The Germans and the Austrians were not considered displaced persons because the displaced persons, the UN defined as those who had fought against the Germans. The Germans and the Austrians were not displaced persons, but under the Truman directive, some of them were allowed to enter the country.
Okay, next question is from Carnegie Council's Grady Jacobson in Massachusetts. We are often taught as children in the US that the liberation of European Jews from Nazi Germany was a major reason the Allies fought in World War II. But if the Allies were not immediately concerned with the injustice perpetrated on the Jewish people, and indeed mistreated them as well, at what point did the attitude towards them change? Do you think it did, or is this idea more of a failure of the historical curriculum?
It's abundantly clear to me that the war was not fought to save the Jews. There is no evidence whatsoever that it was fought to save the Jews. As a matter of fact, Roosevelt and his cabinet went out of their way to discount any word that American boys were being sent over to save Jews. The war was fought for a variety of reasons, but the rescue of the Jews was never part of that. And if that's currently in the textbooks, then that's just wrong. When the war was over, the commonsensical view is that, Americans opened their arms, their pocketbooks to save the Jews, who they had not saved during the war. 6 million had died, but a quarter million remained. And the common sense view is that, again, we opened our arms and welcomed those. That was not the case. In the end, of those 250,000 displaced Jews, only about 50,000 came to the United States as displaced persons. Some of those who went to Israel because there was no place else they could go later came to the United States. But the number of displaced Jews who were allowed into this country was minimal compared to the need.
Okay. This is more of a comment from Phyllis Lee. Non-refoulement is a tenet of international law set up by the UNHCR. Going home, in quotes, could lead to death. There are obligations by receiving countries. Some Jews were forced to settle in Germany, sadly. Even Israel didn't take in everyone at first. It wasn't until 1955 that Israel was willing to do so.
Yes and no. Israel in the very beginning, Ben Gurion said, we will take all the Jews that can come. And Israel set up a organization to bring the Jews who had tuberculosis, who were sick, who were infirm, to bring them to Israel. There were groups, the large numbers of Jews who remained in Germany were those who had gone to Israel, found that they couldn't live there because it was in a state of war, came back to Germany. And there were groups of Orthodox Jews who remained in Germany. But for the most part, the Israelis accepted the Jews. There are questions about whether they could have treated them better once they got to Israel. And there was also some resistance to bringing them into the country. But Israel did open its doors. It felt an obligation to take in as many Jews as wanted to come to Israel.
Okay, this question goes back to one of Joel's, but it's a little bit more specific. It's from Carnegie Council's Billy Pickett. Are there any lessons we can learn from the last million when looking at the US border with Mexico?
Yes. Let me start with two. One, there has to be a fact-based approach. I mean, we can't let, just as the Jews were kept out because of this myth that they were Bolsheviks, so all of us have to do everything we can to counter this myth of Mexicans who don't want to work hard or are criminals, or Hondurans who are all Hondurans and Colombians are gang members. I mean, there has to be a fact-based realism. At the same time, humanitarian interests at some point have to override geopolitical interests and political differences. And we have to open our hearts and our souls and our minds to the crisis on the southern border. And there's no sign that is being done under the current administration. One would hope that it changes.
So,
Alex, I can take it now. We're coming to the
okay, great.
conclusion. I want to make sure David had a chance to sum up. David, I have a big question. We may have to have a separate conversation over lunch sometime about. I don't want to get into counterfactual history, but I know that a big part of the book was you're talking about, really, as you were saying, how the war really doesn't end and it blends into the Cold War. And Did you give any thought to just sort of a counterfactual about some things that could have been done differently? And maybe it feeds off the answer you just gave, but were we able to sort of go back there in time, seeing Cold War on the horizon, how this problem might have been addressed in a way that would have been more positive and led to perhaps less confrontation with the Soviets as we found out?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it would have been possible to cooperate with the Soviets. And what the Soviets wanted was, the Soviets had a lot of the Nazi records. They had a lot of the German records. The Soviets also had eyewitnesses from the Baltic states and the Ukraine who knew who the war criminals were. And if the Americans had cooperated with the Soviets, war criminals would have been found and brought to justice. Now, the Americans didn't cooperate with the Soviets because we didn't trust the Soviets, and we were right to. But you don't have to trust them. We didn't have to trust them entirely to enter into some sort of cooperative relationship with them early on. And that was not done. And as a result, the Soviets were convinced that we were keeping these war criminals in camps because they were anti-communist, which was possibly true. And the hostility between the Soviets and the American coalition increased to the point where it was unmanageable.
So we're right now at the top of the hour, so we have to adjourn this session. David, thank you very much for spending this time with us. This is one of those books where it really is another life-changing experience for me. It makes me look at the end of the war in a completely different way. So thank you so much. We'll look forward to continuing the conversation in the future.
Well, thank you. This has been a terrific conversation. Thank you very much. And thank